John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 17th of March 1942. The second of three children, Gacy had a difficult upbringing. His father was an alcoholic who was reportedly both mentally and physically abusive to his children and their mother.
His father spent apparently all of Gacy's childhood demeaning him and physically punishing him and telling him how stupid and worthless and effeminate he was.
Gacy's childhood friend Barry Buscelli remembers the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father.
If Johnny was 2 minutes late, no food. So a lot of times Johnny ate at our house and stayed at our house overnight. He used to take Johnny when he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he would take his fist and hit Johnny in the face.
The father is a very significant figure in the genesis of Gacy's terrible deeds. For, to my mind, Gacy was always trying to satisfy his father, whom he never could. He was beaten repeatedly by his father, with belts, with brooms. At one stage he was knocked out by him.
These people grow up with such a malignant view of the world and of human relationships, and feeling that human relationships are not based on love and trust and respect, that they're all based on exploitation and cruelty and inflicting pain.
Gacy was a sickly child. He suffered from a heart condition, limiting his involvement in sports activities and consequently alienating him from his peers. Aged 11, an accident in a playground led to his teenage years being blighted by blackouts and hospital visits.
At that time, the swings were wooden base swings with heavy chains coming down. Johnny went to grab it, and the swing clipped him right across the forehead and knocked him to the ground.
By 1966, 24-year-old Gacy was married and had relocated to the city of Waterloo, 300 miles west of Chicago, in the neighboring state of Iowa.
Well, Gacy got married and life from the outside appeared to be relatively normal. He had quite a good job. His wife had 2 children. So they appeared to be the typical cereal box American nuclear family. And Gacy wasn't just a regular family man. He was also quite active in the local Chamber of Commerce, and he played quite an active role. And he was a real figure in the local community.
Gacy had started to build the perfect life for himself, but he was concealing a dark secret. He developed an unhealthy sexual interest in young boys.
There was a son of a fellow JC member who he lured back to his home and he sexually assaulted. So he's abusing power. He's getting into these positions of trust and he's taking advantage, and that's a theme that's going to continue for him.
And then when the kid revealed this to his father, and Gacy was arrested for it, Gacy hired another teenager to intimidate this kid, to lure this kid into some remote place and spray mace in his eyes and beat him up and warn him against testifying in Gacy's case.
Despite Gacy's efforts, his victim still testified, but there wasn't conclusive proof of an attack. Therefore, police were only able to charge him with sodomy of the 15-year-old boy.
He pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy, thinking he would get a very, very minimal sentence. But the judge threw the book at him, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
On the 3rd of December 1968, Gacy was sent to Anamosa State Penitentiary.
Gacy actually handcuffs himself and turns around and struggles with the handcuffs, and then turns back and he holds the handcuffs up. And Pisces is pretty amazed at that, and he said, well, that's neat, how'd you do that? So Gacy says, well, here, you handcuff yourself, and I'll show you how to do that. So Pisces handcuffs himself, and he struggles, and he struggles, and he struggles. And he looks at Gacy and he says, now, what's the trick to this? And Gacy reaches in his pocket and pulls out a key to the handcuffs, and he says, the trick is, you gotta have this key.
This handcuff trick was part of an horrific yet clinical MO.
Gacy, throughout all of the 33 killings, had developed a method of killing these young kids.
He would pick up these victims. Some were kids who worked for him, but most were teenage runaways, and bring them back to his house and giving them drinks. He would sort of trick them into handcuffing themselves or being handcuffed.
Gacy would use chloroform to subdue his victims. Chloroform's an old-fashioned anaesthetic, really, so it gets into your lungs and it just renders you unconscious very effectively.
He did what he called the rope trick. And when he had these young kids incapacitated like that, he would slip a rope over their neck, a knotted rope like a loop, and then put the stick in the back like a tourniquet, and he would slowly turn the tourniquet. And he said he had it perfected so well that he knew exactly how the body would react to each half turn.
Putting a ligature around the neck, the first thing it's going to block is the blood vessels, so it prevents blood getting to the brain, prevents it getting back to the body from the brain. It's going to be very uncomfortable, and it can even render you unconscious in a small number of seconds.
And he went into detail on how he would torture these young men. And he, in fact, did double and triple murders. He would incapacitate 2 or 3 people at a time and kill one person in front of the other victims, and then continue to kill the other victims. And he seemed to be pretty proud of that. We used that to our advantage to keep him talking, and he described every killing to a T, exactly how it happened, all 33.
As the news broke across the country, one shocked viewer who'd unknowingly experienced Gacy's MO firsthand was his ex-employee, Tony Antonucci. Whilst working for PDM, Tony had accidentally got a nail stuck in his foot.
John took me and I got a tetanus shot and took me home. And he came over later that evening to check on if I was okay, or that was the theory, but he also had, some wine, and we were drinking, and he was kind of joking around. It was probably 10:30 at night. I was a high school wrestler, and he said, "Oh, you're a big wrestler guy," and he started wrestling around with me. He got my left arm, and he got it behind me, and I felt him put a handcuff on it. I kept flailing my right hand around so that he couldn't get my right arm, but eventually he did get a hold of my right arm, and he knocked me down to the floor with my hands behind me. He left the room for a few minutes, and I realized that if I pulled really hard on my right hand, that I could pull my hand through the handcuff. I could get it out.
By pretending he was still handcuffed, Tony was able to catch Gacy unawares when he returned and turn the situation to his advantage.
I took the handcuff that I had gotten out of, and I handcuffed him on one of his wrists, and I reached into his pocket, got the key, and I handcuffed him behind his back, laying face down. He goes, "You're the only one that not only got out of the handcuffs, you got them on me." And I didn't know what that meant. I thought that this was some type of test that he had performed before. And I let him stay handcuffed for 10 or 15 minutes before I let him out of the handcuffs. And, he had previously agreed that when I let him up, he would leave. And he did.
Tony had no idea just how close he'd come to being another victim of this deadly killer. On the 21st of December 1978, they searched Gacy's home on West Somerdale Avenue for the second time.
When they executed that search warrant, they went in the crawl space, and the very first shovel that they dug, they found human remains.
Police had finally unearthed the secrets that Gacy had thought would stay buried forever.
So they immediately called me, let me know that there was human remains in a crawl space, and at that time I arrested John Gacy for murder. Gacy says he wants to confess, but really he wants to confess to the surveillance team, both myself and my partner and the other team. And now all of a sudden he's got an audience again, and he's on top of the world. And he knows he can't get out of it at this point, and so he might as well just divulge everything that actually happened.
Gacy told detectives he was willing to draw a map of the burial site beneath his home.
I gave him a pen, and he started right up. He squared it off in the thing, and he started, well, this was a double, and this was a triple, and this was the first guy with put an X on it. Went around the whole crawl space with these places where the body was buried. I mean, they were digging with spoons and everything, but they obviously identified where all the bodies were, and they did an overlay of where the bodies were actually found compared to that diagram that he made, and it was unbelievable. It was right on the money.
In total, 27 bodies were discovered in Gacy's crawl space. It wouldn't take long for news of this horrific discovery to filter out to the wider world.
Then the arrest came down, and that was the headline on the local papers, everything, how many bodies they took out of Gacy's basement.
Well, you know, when Gacy's crimes were uncovered, he entered into the record books, you know, as America's most prolific serial murderer. The notion that this, you know, pudgy, normal-seeming, decent, regular, ordinary guy was living in this horror house, you know, that was just suffused with the stench of death, and that there were the rotting bodies of 27 young men in his crawl space, bringing home and torturing young boys right in the midst, you know, of all his neighbors, and then going off to work the next day.
When we booked him for murder, we asked Gacy where he was born. And Gacy looked at us and said, "I was born in a state of confusion." And he smiled like that, and we captured the photo.
In total, Gacy confessed to the murder of 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978.
Port was born in Southend-on-Sea in February 1975, left Southend at the age of about 1, and his parents moved to Dagenham in Essex.
He seems to have come from quite an average working class background, which was, to all intents and purposes, relatively normal from the outside. He seems to be a boy who was quite quiet, he was quite awkward, he wasn't somebody who was a great conversationalist. And it's been said that when he was at school, some people thought that he was deaf because he was that detached and that disengaged from other people. So he's always been very insular and very introverted.
After taking his GCSEs, Port enrolled into art college, but had to drop out because his family couldn't afford the fees.
He had to basically choose something else, so he went on and trained to be a chef. So I think he's always got that sense of frustration and that sense of entitlement. I think he has this idea that I have this talent, I have this skill, I should be able to develop that, and I'm not able to because of other people. So I think that stays with him for quite a long time.
Aged 30, Port moved out of his family home and into a flat on Cook Street in nearby Barking, East London. One of his new neighbours was Ryan Edwards.
I first met Stephen when I moved to Barking in April 2005, and I lived in a first floor flat, and it overlooked where I would discover Stephen lived. And as a young gay man myself, I didn't know anyone gay in the local area. So it didn't take me long, really, to introduce myself to him. He was a very tall man, sort of a towering physical presence, and he actually walked with almost like a bit of a lumber stroke lurch. He was very much a man of few words, so when he used to talk to me, he often didn't give eye contact. He would bow his head, and he would often give 1 or 2 word answers.
And it wasn't long before Ryan started to notice some strange behaviour from his new neighbour.
I think there was something stunted about Stephen's mental development. I remember something a bit peculiar. I was going to host a party. I was just putting some rubbish out, and there was a toy truck there, and I thought Stephen will love that. And I was with a friend at the time, and I said, "You can't give a grown man a toy truck." And I was like, "Yeah, but from what I knew of Stephen, I think he'd really like it." So at the party, I gave him the toy truck. And lo and behold, he was absolutely overjoyed with it. He then sat cross-legged on the floor and started pushing the toy truck up and down. He was obviously in his complete own world while the party was going on around him.
He retains quite a childlike quality to him, even as an adult. So he collects children's toys and he plays with those toys almost like he's a child. So the idea of the judgment of other people and what others would think of his behaviour really doesn't impact upon him in the same way that it does the rest of us.
On the 28th of August 2014, just 5 days after he moved into Port's flat on Cook Street, Gabriel Cavari was found dead. A woman walking her dog in the graveyard of St. Margaret's Church found his lifeless body propped up against a wall.
It was an awful realization. He was, he seemed like such a nice, pure person, and coming to this country, and what a way to be welcomed by this country to end in such awful circumstances.
It appeared that he, Gabriel Cavari, had died of a drugs overdose. But the shocking reality was that Stephen Port had drugged and killed him, just as he did with Anthony Walgate 2 months previously. Port had now killed 2 men. His urges were only intensifying, and in less than a month, another man would be dead. The police had arrested and charged him on perverting the course of justice after he failed to correctly report the death of his first victim, Anthony Walgate. But they had no idea that Port was actually a killer.
I think the key thing about Stephen Port getting away with murder is there's not that connection between actions and consequences. He can take somebody's life and nothing happens, and he continues to get what he wants. He continues to be able to assault his victims and to dispose of their bodies in the most obvious way. And I think he does feel incredibly untouchable at this point in time.
While still out on bail, Port killed for a 3rd time. On the 18th of September, he contacted 21-year-old chef Daniel Whitworth through an online gay dating site, and the two decided to meet. 2 days later, Daniel was found dead. His body was discovered in the graveyard at St. Margaret's Church, in the same spot as Port's second victim, Gabriel Cavari, extraordinarily by the exact same dog walker.
I've come through and I've seen somebody else, a different boy, sitting in exactly the same position, leaning up against the exact same wall, and I'm thinking to myself, please God, no, please not another one.
On the news of his death, Daniel's stepmother, Mandy Pearson, was completely heartbroken.
Well, this is my memory box for Daniel. It's got a lot of things in there, just things that I'm still finding. Anything that I come across that reminds me of him even, I'll just put it in there. Adam, Daniel's father, really did adore his boy. He was going places. And Daniel's dad was very proud of that, extremely proud of that.
But on the 20th of September 2014, the family's lives changed forever.
I opened the door to the police, who immediately removed their hats. And that was when time stood still for me, really. I thought they're not here with good news. They just are not here with good news. I really don't recall what I actually said next. I cried. And so then one of us asked, how? And they did lower their heads and say, well, it looks like he took his own life.
Just like his other 2 victims, Port had poisoned Daniel with a toxic amount of GHB. He then placed his body in the same place as Gabriel Cavari's. In a bizarre move to try and evade capture, Port then wrote and planted a fake suicide note. Just 3 months after being released from prison, Port struck again. On the 14th of September 2015, almost exactly a year since the last murder, the body of 25-year-old forklift driver Jack Taylor was found in the same churchyard as Gabriel Cavari and Daniel Whitworth.
I think the graveyard became a kind of favourite disposal site for him because it served 2 purposes. It got the bodies out of the way, but it also created a bit of a narrative for anybody coming across these individuals. This graveyard was a place where often homeless people who were down on their luck would hang out, and that creates a little bit of a story in the beginning when the bodies are discovered.
Jack's family were devastated but began to question the circumstances surrounding his death.
We know Jack, obviously, and Jack's very particular. He didn't like dark, didn't like it at all, first off. Second of all, Jack wouldn't just walk in a park area, let alone a cemetery or anything like that. You know, he wouldn't.
And it doesn't make sense to leave the house at like 2:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning to go and sit over a park. That doesn't even make sense.
He was just an absolute joy to be around.
Loving, caring, always there for other people.
Determined to find out more, the Taylor family asked to see the CCTV footage of Jack's last known movements. It showed him walking with a tall, blonde stranger. In October 2015, the police put an appeal to the public, and it was soon confirmed that the mysterious man in the footage was Stephen Port.
In the end, it was the determination of Jack Taylor's family to pursue the police that eventually led them to take Port seriously. I believe had that not happened, Port might well have got away, or got away with it.
On the 15th of October 2015, Port was arrested on suspicion of causing the deaths of all 4 young men. The police had a serial killer in custody, one that had previously slipped through their fingers. The police had originally believed that the deaths were all self-administered drug overdoses. They were determined to find out the truth. Detectives searching Port's flat had seized his laptop and mobile phone. They interrogated him about his search history, which included boy drug rapes. His hard drive also contained videos of him having sex with unconscious men. Under questioning, Port admitted that he had met his 3rd victim, Daniel Whitworth, at a sex party, but he knew nothing about his death. He also claimed that he hadn't administered drugs to anyone and denied killing the 4 young men.
He's quite well spoken, he appears to be quite reserved. I think what we're seeing here is a bit of a veneer that he's crafted to present to the rest of the world. You wouldn't think that this is the type of person who could do this kind of thing.
But the police weren't falling for it. They could link Port to all 4 of his victims. On the 18th of October 2015, he was arrested and charged with the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Jack Taylor and Daniel Whitworth. It was a series of gruesome murders that spread fear across California. When Richard Ramirez was finally apprehended by an angry mob in Los Angeles on August the 31st, 1985, it brought to an end one of the most prolific murderers in US history. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, the Satan-worshipping serial killer had terrorized the state of California for 14 months, claiming at least 13 victims. San Francisco detective Frank Falzon met Ramirez face-to-face 4 years after his conviction in September 1989.
About as evil as anything I can imagine. He was intent to hurt, and that's what people have to realize.
Frank worked hard to help capture Ramirez after the Night Stalker murders reached the San Francisco Bay Area in August 1985.
I served 22 years in the San Francisco homicide detail. Numerous cases were broke that I felt very good about. None as high as the Night Stalker. The fact that my partner and I and a few other gentlemen played a key role in breaking this case, it was probably the highlight of my career.
This killer's story begins over half a century ago. Richard Ramirez was born on February the 29th, 1960, to Mexican-born parents in El Paso, Texas.
He was the youngest of 5 children, and the family had quite a kind of turbulent life. So they lived in several different areas, many of which had quite high levels of industrial pollution. Some of his siblings had been born with birth defects, so this family had an awful lot of challenges. That's something that would come to shape Richard's life and those of his siblings, so he hasn't got the best start in life.
And life did not get much better for Ramirez. At a young age, he began rebelling against his strict Catholic upbringing.
He's 9, his brain is still developing, he's sniffing glue, he's smoking marijuana, there's emotional trauma that's happening in the family too.
His father was a brutal, short-tempered man. I'm not suggesting it was classic child abuse, but there was certainly physical violence. And Richie Ramirez shrank away, if you like, from his father. And he took refuge in the company of a cousin.
Ramirez's cousin, Mike, returned from the Vietnam War in 1971. He was scarred by the atrocities he'd seen and had committed as a Special Forces Green Beret.
So we have a grizzled, damaged Vietnam vet, Mike, and a frail, probably suggestible boy. And Mike proceeds to explain to him the dreadful things he's done to Vietnamese women while in Vietnam. He's tied them to trees, he's raped them, he's beheaded them, he's taken photographs of it.
He came home telling stories of this to Richard, and he would boast about it. So Richard now has a real-life killing machine to look up to and to admire.
12-year-old Ramirez was fascinated by his older cousin.
So he starts spending an awful lot of time with Mike. He's quite a significant influence on young Richard's life, and he's very impressionable at this age. So this really is kind of cementing some of those ideas that he's had about harming other people in order to feel powerful.
And that must have distorted Ramirez's value systems and the way in which he responded to women in general. They became objects, they were not real, and they became, how can one put it politely, not entirely human.
On May the 4th, 1973, Ramirez witnessed an event that would cement his feelings towards women and his admiration for cousin Mike.
He keeps his gun in the fridge because he says he likes to keep it cool. And this is another thing I think that quite impresses Richard. And one day Mike has a huge argument with his wife and ends up killing her. He shoots her in the face. And Richard is there in the house when this happens. What you've got here is it's a combination of things that have been going on. So a young lad who looks up to people who are violent, a young lad who hears stories of violence, and now he's actually seeing it happen.
Mike was a powerful influence in the direction of psychopathy, rage discontrol, and the merger, and this is the most important thing, the merger of sexual impulses and violent impulses into a single coherent force.
Now, the impact that must have had on a boy who's been taking marijuana with a man who he clearly hero worships, it must have scrambled Ramirez's brain.
And his reaction to it is quite interesting, because when he talks about it afterwards, he doesn't talk about how he feels seeing this woman murdered in front of him. He talks about it very objectively. He talks about the body falling to the floor, about blood spurting out of the wound. It's not about feeling disgusted or feeling traumatized or sad. He's just giving a very cold description. And I think this really does tell us what kind of person Ramirez is turning into.
Mike was immediately arrested. In court, he was judged to be not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Instead of prison, he was sent to a mental institution and released in 1977.
Ramirez, in the meantime, because he's removed from his hero, goes to stay with his sister and husband.
He's lost his idol, he's lost his role model, and he is basically now starting to ruminate and to think about the things that he wants to do. So he doesn't look after himself, he's very unkempt, he's dirty, he doesn't wash, and so he becomes even more of an outcast. So he very much gets lost in his own head at this point in time, and he's planning what he's going to do next.
Age 17, Ramirez was ready to turn his twisted fantasies into reality.
While he was still at school, he got a job working at a Holiday Inn, and he got a pass key for all the rooms. And he took it upon himself one day to decide that while the husband was away parking the car, he would go into the room that they just both moved into and he would attempt to rape the wife.
The husband comes in and he sees what's going on and basically beats Richard Ramirez to a bloody pulp. But this couple, they're from out of town, they're on holiday. They don't want to follow this up. They don't want to pursue this case.
The couple decided not to press charges. It was a lucky escape for Ramirez. Living on the edges of society, his behaviour became more and more unpredictable.
So he's dirty, he's unkempt, he's sleeping in graveyards, he's increasingly kind of going over to the dark side. And the things that appeal to him are things that most people would find really odd and really bizarre, devil worship, that sort of thing. So he's gone on this trajectory now, and I think that's only going to go one way.
Aged 18, Richard Ramirez headed west to California. The Golden State would become his hunting ground. 5 years later, in June 1984, he would claim the first murder victim of a 14-month killing spree. Anyone was a target, and everyone was petrified. Where would Ramirez strike next? By 1984, Richard Ramirez had become a social outcast. Fueled by a hatred of women and a distinct lack of morals, the 24-year-old had settled into a life on the fringes of society in downtown Los Angeles. On Friday, August the 30th, 1985, a mugshot on file from December 1984 was released to all media across California.
When a serial killer is moving around geographically, it's really important to enlist the aid of the media, which can get the word out, sketches and things like that out to the public, because the public becomes an asset to you. And oftentimes, these cases are resolved by somebody recognizing the person.
The following morning, Saturday, August the 31st, 1985, Ramirez boarded a Greyhound bus in Tucson, Arizona, where he'd gone to visit his brother. He headed back to LA, unaware that he was a wanted man.
Saturday morning, Richard Ramirez's picture was front page in every newspaper in the state of California.
When he arrives back in Los Angeles, he gets off the Greyhound bus and somebody recognizes him from the picture that's been circulating in the press. And essentially, the predator now becomes the prey. Lots of people start chasing after him. And eventually, they catch up with him, and Richard Ramirez, the serial killer, is no more.
Not surprisingly, given the atmosphere in Los Angeles at the time, they attack him ferociously, kicking him, hitting him. But he's pinned down by the locals. He's not caught by two of LA's finest or even the police department. He's caught by a group of local onlookers. A true citizen's arrest, you might say.
As the local police arrived to break up the melee, it took a bit of time to realize who they had sitting in the back of their squad car.
This one cop looks real close. He says, Jesus, it's the Night Stalker, it's Richard Ramirez. He goes out over the air and announces they have the Night Stalker in custody.
After 14 months of fear, the residents of California could rest a little easier. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was off the streets and in police custody. Ireland's mother struggled to settle down, and by the age of 10, he'd changed schools 6 times. They had also changed home 9 times, including a short spell in a homeless shelter for women and children.
And then she met a new husband. They had a child together, and they made the decision that it was too hard to raise both these children in the same household. And so he was sent away and put in a home. And the message that gets sent when a parent does that is, you're just baggage. You're not a part of my future. I don't love you. I'll dispose of you when and as I see fit.
And this is a really crucial time for our development as children. Our relationships with our parents are absolutely fundamental at this point in time. And when you have an interrupted or a disrupted attachment, particularly with your mother, that has a real impact on your ability to form attachments with other people throughout your life. So you've got all of the ingredients for at least a problematic life, but unfortunately, it's not just problematic, it becomes fatal.
Constantly on the move, Ireland regularly found himself as the new boy at yet another school.
Witnesses that we spoke to told us that he was picked on at school and he was a bit of a loner, really.
He was not a popular child at school. He was bullied by others. And when you have that sense of isolation from your peers and that inability to form those relationships, you do really turn in on yourself and you become very insular, very isolated. And your reaction to others' behaviour towards you is maladaptive, it's abnormal. So he would react by being violent, he would react by setting fire to things. So there are some real warning signs here of a very, very troubled individual indeed.
In 1966, 12-year-old Ireland found himself a summer job in his hometown of Dartford.
At one point he was working in a fairground and a man propositioned him with gifts if he had sex with him. We can only with hindsight say that that may well have shaped his view of gay men.
And often sexual predators will prey on people like him. So they would have picked up on those vulnerabilities. They would have picked up on the fact that he was the odd one out, that he didn't have much of a support network around him and targeted him for these advances.
You have, in this petri dish of adolescence, all these things added together. Abandoned, mother struggling in poverty, school to school, bullied, an extraordinary conflation of ingredients that might make a serial killer. And slowly but surely, that reality began to emerge.
As Ireland grew up, life didn't get any easier. He often found himself on the wrong side of the law.
By the time he was in his late 20s, he'd already accumulated a fairly substantial criminal record. He'd been in and out of prison for things like robbery, theft, deception type offences, and he became interested in survivalism.
Committed. So here's an individual who knows how to cover his tracks, and he's got that in mind from the outset.
He was not a teenager or an aggressive young man of 22. He was a man who had thought out what was going to happen. And what was going to happen was a spree of killings that was to send shivers down the spine of the gay community in London.
As well as a type of victim, Ireland had identified a hunting ground, a gay pub in the Earl's Court district of London called the Coleherne Arms. He was confident he'd be able to entice his prey.
He'd gone from this kind of skinny youth to being quite a burly, well-built, big guy. He was quite tall, a sort of imposing presence. Obviously, in that sense, that sort of sadomasochistic thing, he might have appealed to a certain type of man who wanted to be dominated by another man.
With everything in place, Ireland was ready to kill for the first time. On the night of March the 8th, 1993, he met his unsuspecting victim.
Peter Walker was a 45-year-old theatre director that Ireland met in the Coleherne Arms. They went back to Walker's flat.
Peter Walker has two dogs, a Labrador and a German Shepherd. They shut the dogs in the living room and proceed into the bedroom. Peter accepts that sadomasochism is part of the routine that he likes to play, part of the role, and therefore allows Ireland to tie him to the bed.
And Ireland whipped him, and he held a plastic bag over his head and suffocated him.
With plastic bag asphyxia, you're looking at a situation where it's lack of oxygen that causes you to die rather than lack of blood flow to your brain. And that is a much more prolonged and much more unpleasant feeling. Anyone who's kept their head under a swimming pool for a bit longer than they normally would will know that air hunger, as it's called, that desire to breathe, and knowing that that's not going to be allowed would be a terrible way to die.
After killing Peter Walker, Ireland created a bizarre spectacle at the scene.
He drapes condoms over his victim's face. He poses 2 teddy bears in the oral sex position. And this is demeaning to his victim. So he's not just killed his victim, he's humiliated him as well. And this is something that Ireland is doing to say, hey, everybody, look at me. This isn't just a murder. This is more than just a murder.
And Ireland's cruelty didn't end there.
He set fire to his pubic hair. He said later to see what it smelt like. The poor man was already dead. Why humiliate his body anymore?
Ireland didn't flee Peter Walker's flat with any urgency. He spent the night there, cleaning up any evidence that he may have left behind before disposing of the murder kit on the morning train back to Southend.
He was throwing cuffs in the Thames or out of a train window and disposed of every single murder weapon that he used to kill or strangle them.
So clearly, evidence that would be on that.
To go home to the flat.
After forcing Emanuel Spiteri to give him his cash card and PIN number, Ireland strangled him to death with a rope. This time, the 39-year-old killer tried a new way to hide the evidence.
There'd been an attempt to burn the flat. The furniture had been piled up. He'd clearly set fire to it. Oxygen had run out, and that's why it went out. And very, very fortunately, because it was a top-floor flat, and he could easily have killed people below and to the side of it.
We know that he's done a lot of reading around cases of serial murder. He's probably got an awareness that fire is one of the few things that will destroy DNA. So I think what's going on here is that he's trying to destroy the evidence that links him to the scene. But at the same time, he wants recognition for the crime as well. What he was doing was creating another murder, creating another scene, and trying to get recognition, but still maintain that anonymity.
Luckily, the fire Ireland had started had gone out and the flat didn't burn down. 3 days later, on the 15th of June, Emanuel Spiteri's landlady found her lodger dead and called the police. They retraced Emanuel Spiteri's last steps and for the first time got a look at the killer's face.
Fortunately, he was captured on CCTV at Charing Cross Station, so we've got Emanuel, 5'2", in front of Colin Ireland, 6'1", on a single shot just coming out of the tube station. Not very clear of the head, but you can see the build and the height, and clearly you've got Emanuel in front of him.
So that was a crucial piece of evidence. Although, obviously, it was not a piece of evidence which would necessarily confirm that he was the killer, but it was that kind of circumstantial evidence on which a case can be built.
Armed with the image, the police went on full offensive to try and catch the killer.
They managed to blow up the image to get something that was a reasonable representation of Ireland. They didn't know what Ireland looked like at the time, but it was something that they could use in publicity to attract attention to the case, to circulate, crucially, amongst the gay community.
Myself and Ken John did a midnight press conference because we were concerned that people were being too relaxed about it. We gave a description of who we were looking for and to warn them that they had to be careful because the next one could be you.
I think there was a general call out amongst the gay community to be very careful who you go home with tonight, kind of thing. There was a great fear, there was great concern.
With the police closing in, Colin Ireland decided there was no point in hiding, and on the 19th of July, he went to see a solicitor.
He decided that I'll go into the solicitor, and he gave an affidavit. He said that, yes, I am the man in the video. Yes, I did go to Emanuel Spiteri's address, but when I got to the front door, there was another man in the flat. I didn't want a threesome, so I went home. It was too late to get a train, so I slept in a nearby churchyard.
Unbeknownst to Ireland, someone from the solicitor's office passed on his details to the police, who already had his fingerprints on file from previous offences.
Eventually we got Ireland's name, cross-matched it against the mark, and it was his. So that placed Colin Ireland in the crime scene and although you can't date a fingerprint, it most certainly helped in the totality of the evidence.
On the 20th of July 1993, Colin Ireland was arrested. On the 22nd, he was charged with the murder of 33-year-old Andrew Collier. The following day, on the 23rd of July, he was charged with the murder of 41-year-old Emmanuel Spiteri.
If Colin Ireland had not been caught when he was, he would have continued to kill relentlessly until he was eventually stopped. It is the classic element of any serial killer. They won't stop until someone stops them.
And there was lots of work done. We had ID parades, we had voice ID parades, forensication, and lots of other things. He never opened his mouth for 3 days. But fortunately, because of the similar fact evidence from the
is somebody who is deliberately targeting men who are upbringing with them. So she was regularly beaten by her grandfather. There were allegations of incest within the family.
Her grandfather had a home-built sauna in his house. And if he wanted to punish her for doing something he didn't like, he'd lock her in the sauna and crank up the heat and just let her stay in there.
Eileen's abusive childhood sent her on a downward spiral and fueled her hatred of men.
This was somebody who was constantly in fear. Wuornos' grandfather allegedly, repeatedly said to her that she was worthless, that she should never have been born, that she was a mistake. So she's learning that she can't trust anyone, that she can't depend upon anybody. And this is very, very dangerous.
Aileen learned early to use any means available to survive.
Before she got to her teen years, she was known as a cigarette bandit. She would trade sexual favors for packs of cigarettes.
It's said that from around age 11, she's using her body as something to trade, as a tool. And this kind of disconnection from her emotions is something that is going to have a significant impact on the rest of her life.
Her behaviour left her pregnant, aged 14.
Now, on the orders of her grandfather, that baby is adopted. It's taken away from her. And this is just reinforcing those ideas that she already has, that those who are supposed to love me hurt me, that I am worthless, that I'm not deserving of love.
Shortly after she was forced to give up her child, Aileen was hit by another tragedy.
Her grandmother dies of liver failure, having been quite a heavy drinker for many years. Her grandfather actually blames her for her grandmother's death.
Her grandfather was furious and threw Wuornos out of the house.
Aged just 15, Wuornos was left homeless. Alone, her only option was to live in the woods at the end of their street.
She lives a very feral existence, sleeping in an old car, and she's still a child at this point. And this is incredibly damaging. There is absolutely nobody there for her. She is literally just taking each day as it comes. She's making sure that she has enough to eat. She is basically using her body as she's used it before. She's learning that life is full of rejection, it's full of pain, it's full of fear, and that she really needs to hurt others before they get the chance to hurt her.
One person she was still close to was her brother Keith. Just 11 months older than Aileen, the rumour was that their relationship was an unnatural one.
There were allegations of incest. School friends of Keith said that they'd witnessed these things going on. So she felt a connection, but it was a very pathological and a very toxic one.
Unable to cope living outside during the cold winter months in Michigan, aged 16, Aileen hitchhiked over 1,000 miles west to the warmer climes of Colorado. 2 years later, she was arrested for her first offence, driving under the influence and disorderly conduct, which included the dangerous discharge of a .22 caliber weapon. Eventually, in 1976, aged 20...
Needed a beer, she'd sit on a pool table and kind of demand her get her another beer or whatever.
Having blown her inheritance, Wuornos took it upon herself to raise the money the two needed to live.
Aileen would go out and prostitute to make money so that she could buy things for Tyria. She would want to take care of her and make sure she was happy and never want to leave her. And I think that was what it boiled down to.
Daytona Beach, Florida, November the 30th, 1989. 33-year-old Aileen Wuornos was now living with lover Tyria Moore and was indulging in a host of petty crimes to maintain their extravagant lifestyle. The frequency of the crimes and the force Wuornos used to enact them was increasing. It all came to a head the night she was picked up by 51-year-old Richard Mallory.
Richard Mallory owned an electrical repair shop, and he'd been divorced for many years, and he didn't make any secret of the fact that he did enjoy engaging in the services of sex workers.
He picked her up hitchhiking, they were drinking, they were hanging out, as it were, and one thing led to another, some type of violent encounter where she ended up killing him. She shot him 4 times with a 9-shot revolver. She took a couple of pieces of property that belonged to him, a camera and a radar detector, and she pawned them. She made some money off of the deal.
When Richard Mallory's body was found 2 weeks after he was killed, there was no evidence to clarify what sparked her rage.
His body was found, it was very decomposed. Basically, all we have to work with is what we have found at the crime scene, the physical evidence and the trace evidence, etc. We do know that he was shot multiple times and his victim was found in a secluded area right outside the city of Daytona.
What triggered Wuornos to kill for the first time remains a mystery. But what is certain is that the murder of Richard Mallory was the beginning of a dark and deadly chapter.
For her entire life, Wuornos has been victimised by men. She's been abused by them. But now she's turned the tables. She's the one that's in control, and she's very much enjoying it because she's learned from a very early age that violence equals power, and she really is on quite a high at this point.
Taking one life once wasn't enough. 6 months later, Wuornos struck again.
There's usually what they call a brief cooling off period, and this absolutely applied here. A large part of it was due to her paranoia and her fear of getting caught. And when she came back from that brief cooling off period, now she was the predator. She was looking for who she was going to kill next.
She's somebody who's being proactive. She's seeking out victims, she's getting access to them, she has an opportunity to harm them, and she takes that opportunity.
These men, they were all white males. They were all traveling the roads alone. They were middle-aged, 40 to 65.
On May the 19th, 1990, she was picked up on the I-75 highway by a 43-year-old machine operator, David Spears. When they pulled over and he began to undress, she slipped out of the passenger's side door, walked around to the driver's side, aimed and fired.
He'd been shot 6 times. One shot was not enough for Wuornos. She was making a point with her killings. She was saying, this is for all the men who have abused me over the years.
This was somebody who enjoyed watching men die because for the first time in her life, she was powerful. She was the one in control. She was the one calling the shots.
Yeah, I'd love to go out, but I said, you stink. You ain't had a bath. And I don't know when, and I said, I stink. And I said, I ain't doing that. I'll go get a motel room and we'll clean up, but I ain't going out with no stinking-ass woman.
Mike told Wuornos to wait for him at the bar while he went to get his room key. Instead, he met with a task force outside.
And I meet with my outside people and tell them, you know, we make a plan because we knew what she had in mind. The exact words I told them was, piss on the fire and call in the dogs. This hunt's over with. This is her. And I'm not going off with her because I'm not going to be the next victim.
Mike returned to the bar with a motel key and showed it to Wuornos. He then waited for her to make the next move.
Did I get worried about it? No, she wasn't going to kill me in the bar. So I wasn't, you know, I really wasn't worried about it, not at that point. I just went and got another beer and said, just whenever you get ready, I'm ready to go, let's go.
A little while later, Wuornos and the undercover cop walked out of the bar. The owner of the last resort, Al Bulling, was an eyewitness to what happened next.
They were just sitting at the bar drinking, you know. They didn't want to arrest her in the bar or anything because they didn't know what she had or didn't want nobody else getting hurt. So they waited for her to walk out the door. As soon as they hit the door, that's when they arrested her.
Wuornos was bundled into a car and taken away. The task force had successfully executed the arrest safely.
I wasn't worried about my safety because I had the best backup in the world.
It was a relief. I think that's the best way to describe it, as a relief.
The next day, investigators managed to track down Wuornos' partner, Tyria Moore, in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
And they said to her, let's make a deal. If you can provide evidence, if you can help us convict Aileen Wuornos, then we will give you immunity from prosecution. So I think this was a very, very tempting offer.
Tyria agreed to call Aileen and let the police record their conversations.
Lee, they're coming after me. I know they are.
No, they're not.
What?
I'm not going to go to jail or anything. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
Okay. Yes. Why the hell did you do this? Why did you do this?
Listen, Ty.
Wait.
I'll probably never be able to see you.
Yes.
I love you. If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble, I will.
Okay.
I love you.
No. We'll do it now. Get it over with.
Right this very moment?
Yes. Get it over with.
All right.
The same month she was arrested, Aileen Wuornos fully confessed to the 7 murders.
Well, I came here to confess. I wanted to be straight up with one thing right there and now. Sure. The reason I'm confessing is there's not another girl. I did it. There is no other girl.
Okay, so then what you're telling us is you're voluntarily coming forward to talk to us now.
Yeah, to let you know that I'm the one that did the charge.
Despite the seriousness of her... He was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas on March the 9th, the eldest of 4 boys born to William and Dorothea Rader.
Rader was born in 1945, and he was one of several children within a very traditional nuclear family. His father was strict, but not particularly abusive, and many children grew up in households like this.
He was upright, he was a scout, he was on all sorts of programs for good children. He had the ability to blend in. He wasn't bullied, for example, as a lot of killers are.
To his friends and family, he was a model child, but in private, Rader began to show his true colours.
Rader claims that when he was a youngster, he abused animals, so he hung a cat and he hung a dog. We do see, in quite a few cases of serial killers, animal harm in the background.
As he went into puberty, he described himself as looking at girly mags, developing a fascination with underwear, and then, significantly, and indeed deeply significant in his later crimes, was a fascination with bondage and sadomasochism.
Having graduated from a local high school in Wichita, in 1965, Rader enrolled in Kansas Wesleyan College in Salina, 90 miles from home. However, he dropped out.
In 1966, when Rader was 21, he joined the United States Air Force and remained in it for 4 years. He worked on systems. He was that kind of man. Systems are very much his kind of thing. He served abroad, sometimes in Europe. As far as we know, not a particularly distinguished career, but not a bad one. He returns to Wichita, Kansas, and marries a girl he was at school with.
Rader marries and has 2 children, and from the outside they do very much look like the respectable cereal box family, just like any other regular American family.
In 1974, Rader suddenly and inexplicably changed from the respected ex-forces gentleman to a brutal, evil killer.
There has to be something that set him off, because that first explosion of violence was so shocking, so dramatic, so utterly horrifying that you couldn't possibly have imagined. It was like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
A new family to the neighborhood became his first victims.
The Otero family had recently moved to Wichita because they wanted a new start. This was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But unfortunately, this was to be very short-lived, because one day the teenage children arrive home to the most horrendous scene.
On January the 15th, 1974, Wichita police were called to the scene. Detective Tim Ralph was one of the task force investigators on the BTK case in later years.
At the Otero house, they were actually called by the children. The 3 older children had come home, and they had found their mother and father. They called, and the first responders, or the first people that arrived at that time, they went to the bedroom, they found the father and the mother.
The scene they discovered was horrendous. Dennis Rader had broken into the family home and murdered everyone in the house in a way that would become his trademark.
He ties up husband and wife with a Venetian blind cord, suffocates them.
The older children didn't want their younger siblings to come home and find this because they thought they were at school. And so the officers went to their elementary schools in the area and found that both of the younger siblings had not made it to school that day.
When officers searched the house, it soon became clear that the parents weren't the only victims. 9-year-old Joseph and his sister Josephine, 11, were both found murdered.
Their 11-year-old daughter is found hanging in the basement, whether he killed her by hanging her or strangled her and then strung up the body. We have a situation where he's created elaborate knotwork and hung the body up. It's almost like some sort of macabre art display.
Rader appeared to have fixated on the younger daughter, Josephine, because he seems to have spent the most time with her body. She was the prize, and the others were just obstacles that he had to get out of the way.
He kills the boy, ties him up, leaves on the floor of his bedroom, again suffocated.
Rader had killed 4 members of the Otero family: 38-year-old Joseph, 33-year-old Julie, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine.
The Otero case provided an overall mindset of this person, that he certainly was into some kind of minding fantasy.
The way Rader had killed the family showed the beginnings of what would become his modus operandi.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again. So literally holding them on the edge of life and death, watching the life drain out of them and then giving it back. So having that power over somebody's survival or somebody's demise is something that this killer very much enjoyed.
This was not, sadly, the act of a madman. It was the first of a series of killings in Wichita that would come to terrify the town. In January, they have the Otero killings. In April, they have Catherine's killing and Kevin's attack. They have no idea what they have on their hands. I don't imagine they get an awful lot of these kinds of attacks in Wichita.
By the end of the year, the police thought they'd had a breakthrough in their investigation of the killings.
In October 1974, and the police arrest 3 men on the suspicion of the Otero killings. Rader is furious. This is an outrage. Those were my killings. Nobody else. This is absolutely not acceptable. You can almost hear him saying it to himself. This is not right.
Incensed that his murders were being attributed to someone else, Rader wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and hid it inside a textbook at the Wichita Public Library. He then phoned the Otero murder hotline to describe where the letter could be found.
In his letter, claiming credit for the Otero killings, it's not quite well written. It's clumsy, misspelt, bad grammar, but the overall motive is absolutely clear.
Rader attempted to justify the killings with the phrase, "I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being torture and being mine." Understanding the fear he was causing, Rader went one step further and gave his murderous alter ego a name.
He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity. He didn't just want to be a nameless killer. So he didn't want to get caught, and he also wanted recognition for his crimes. So he had to come up with a moniker: bind, torture, kill.
Dennis Rader was to be known as BTK, and as he communicated with the press, Rader made a chilling threat that he was to strike again. Police still didn't have enough to make an arrest. They needed hard proof that Dennis Rader was the BTK killer.
They have got no probable cause to demand a DNA sample from Rader, so they take the unlikely step of going to the hospital asking for a cervical smear that his daughter had given and comparing the DNA that they got from various crime scenes, the semen they'd found. And they find that it's extremely close. The match is in cream. Must be a family member.
The police could finally move in.
A large contingent of people were sent toward Park City on February the 25th of 2005. And at 12:15, he was taken into custody.
Rader is finally arrested and is eventually charged with 10 murders, including the Oteros.
The police had many crimes they suspected Rader and his alter ego BTK of committing. But at that time, only he knew the full extent of the truth. The interrogation was a delicate affair.
We had broken up the case into several different sections, so we started to rotate in investigators, and he would be more than a year and talked for almost 34 hours. And he almost saw himself as an instructor of, as he called it, the golden age of serial killing.
When they're done with the interviews, I'm back from doing my search warrants. He's in the interview room, and they put the vest on him, and they're hooking him up with the shackles and belly chain and that kind of thing. And I just kind of stuck my head in the door and said, it's nice to be able to put a face go along with the name that I found on the floppy disk. And he looks up, and he's kind of got the shackles like that, and looks up and says, "Oh, so you're the one, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm the one." So we kind of joked back and forth. And he was in a good mood. He was joking, and he said, "Oh, if I ever get out of here, I'm gonna have to find you and stuff your mouth full of a case of floppy disks."
Finally, the infamous BTK was off the streets and in custody.
So we took him over to the jail. Everybody in the holding cells and area in there knew that it happened. The cells in there are all glassed off, and so all the inmates in there, they all come up to the glass, and they're looking at the glass, and then they start pounding on the glass, chanting his name, pounding on the glass, going, "BTK, BTK." And then he's got a big old smile, and he's got his hands there. He goes, 2 thumbs up, as he's 2 thumbs up to everybody chanting his name. So, I mean, he just loved that.
On the 1st of March 2005, Dennis Rader had been charged with the murders of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerly, and Dolores E. Davis.